then you know the libel law.
Shut up, moron. Shut up.
Okay, hold on.
Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about, idiot.
Next to the president, the chief character in this rapidly metastasizing scandal is, of course, Trump's personal lawyer, that man there, Rudy Giuliani. And helpfully, just like a Bond villain or Shakespeare's Iago, Giuliani came on stage back in May and explicitly told the audience what his villainous plot was, that he was going to use his proximity to the president to work over and pressure Ukraine to open up an investigation into Joe Biden's family, part of which he was doing while Trump was withholding aid from Ukraine. Giuliani literally told the Times that he was planning a Ukraine trip to push for inquiries that could help Trump and that, quote, we're meddling in an investigation. His words. And meddle he did. Giuliani's been working for months to push the Ukrainians to dig up dirt on Biden. On that July phone call in which Trump pressured the Ukrainian president to do his bidding, the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky assured Trump, quote, I will personally tell you that one of my assistants spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently, and we are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine and we will meet once he comes to Ukraine. The meddling by Giuliani, who, remember, is not a public official in any way, reportedly greatly alarmed national security officials who told the Washington Post that Giuliani had pursued a shadow Ukraine agenda while they were pushed to the sidelines. I'm joined now by one of the authors of that report, Washington Post national security correspondent Greg Miller. Greg, it's great reporting, and the big takeaway I had was there were people inside the U.S. government watching this happen who were alarmed by Giuliani's role and the ways Ukraine policy were veering more broadly. What can you tell us?
Yeah, and that alarm grew and expanded and intensified over time. I mean, it starts with some of what you just showed in those clips, Giuliani declaring that he's on his way to Ukraine, and, you know, U.S. officials' ears perk up. Why? What is he going to do there? We don't know anything about this. On what authority? And then, you know, the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine is suddenly and abruptly removed from that job as part of a sort of right-wing campaign against her that included Giuliani. And so that tension and that concern about what he's doing builds and builds until it culminates in this July 25th call.
So what is your understanding of the relationship between the officials who actually run Ukraine policy, like the people at state, like there's a whole bunch of civil servants who deal with this, and Giuliani? Did they know what was happening?
No, these were parallel and in completely unconnected universes here, and that was a huge issue and a huge source of anxiety for people in the White House. They were not privy to what Giuliani was doing. As one person told me in the story, we were learning about it like everybody else by assembling bits and pieces from watching television news. So, I mean, they were completely in the dark about it, and they were, but yet they were trying to contend with aspects of it. There were officials at the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine who were being asked by Ukrainian officials, what are we supposed to make of Rudy Giuliani? Is he an official representative of you guys or not? Who do we deal with in this government?
The Giuliani, I want to play you what his claim is, that this was all set up by the State Department. He was just doing it at the State Department's behest. I want you to take a listen and tell us what your reporting indicates. Take a listen.
Insiders saying, you muck this up. Your response?
Man, I really did. And you know who I did it at the request of? The State Department. I never talked to a Ukrainian official until the State Department called me and asked me to do it. And then I reported every conversation back to them. And Laura, I'm a pretty good lawyer, just a country lawyer, but it's all here, right here. The first call from the State Department.
Do we know if that's true?
I mean, so I would say two things about that. One is, we're still early in this investigation, and we don't know everything about that. We don't know the extent to which Giuliani was coordinating with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, although some of the reporting we've done at the Post suggests that was an exaggeration, if not worse, by Giuliani. The other is, I mean, I suppose investigators will find it helpful that he insists that he has the receipts for this and he holds up his phone like that. I'm sure they're going to want to see that phone and see what's on those calls and those records, because he's functioning as a freelance person here. He is not a U.S. official. He is not, I don't think, entitled to client-attorney privilege in this case, which was true when he was representing Trump in the relationship to the Mueller investigation. So So I imagine that will be of intense interest to investigators on Capitol Hill.
All right, Greg Miller, thank you so much for making time tonight. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.